The heavy, humid air of Alexandria in the summer of 30 BC didn't smell of salt or jasmine, but of the cold, metallic scent of an approaching end. Inside the royal quarters of the palace, a woman who had charmed emperors and commanded fleets sat perfectly still, surrounded by the golden opulence of a dynasty that had ruled for 3 centuries. She knew the Roman legions were at the gates. She knew her lover, Mark Antony, was dead by his own hand. And she knew that Octavian, the future Augustus, didn't want her heart. He wanted her in chains, a living trophy to be paraded through the streets of Rome. But Cleopatra was never one to follow a script written by her enemies. As the sun beat down on the Mediterranean, a small basket of figs was carried past the Roman guards, an unassuming gift that would become the most debated delivery in the history of the ancient world. Within hours, the last Pharaoh of Egypt would be dead, and the world would never be the same. In this exploration, we're going behind the propaganda of the victors to uncover the truth of Cleopatra's final act of sovereignty. We will peel back the layers of Roman smear campaigns to reveal a brilliant polyglot, a master strategist, and a mother who was playing a high-stakes game of survival, not just for herself, but for an entire empire. We are looking at the machinery of power, the collapse of a Mediterranean superpower, and the final desperate gambit of a woman who refused to be a footnote in Rome's history. If you're into stories like this, the deep, often dark histories of empires and the figures who dared to defy them, stay with us as we deconstruct the fall of the Ptolemies. To understand the weight of 30 BC, we have to go back to the beginning of the end. When Cleopatra ascended the throne in 51 BC, at just 18 years old, she didn't inherit a stable kingdom. She inherited a family tradition of fratricide, civil war, and crushing debt. The Ptolemies were technically Greek, descendants of one of Alexander the Great's generals, but they had ruled Egypt since 323 BC. By the time Cleopatra took the crown alongside her brother, Ptolemy XIII, the Roman Republic had already begun to cast a long, suffocating shadow over the Nile. Egypt was the wealthiest nation in the world, but it was essentially a Roman client state, kept afloat by bribes paid to the Roman Senate. Cleopatra's father, Auletes, had spent a fortune in bribes and tributes just to keep his throne, leaving his daughter a kingdom that was economically drained but strategically indispensable. Cleopatra was different from her predecessors. While the earlier Ptolemies often refused to even learn the Egyptian language, staying isolated in their Greek-style capital of Alexandria, Cleopatra immersed herself in the culture of her subjects. She spoke at least 9 languages and was the first in her line to master the native Egyptian tongue. This wasn't just a hobby, it was a political weapon. She understood that power in Egypt wasn't just about military might, it was about divinity. By presenting herself as the living reincarnation of the goddess Isis, she secured a level of loyalty from the Egyptian priesthood and the common people that her brother could only dream of. She knew that to survive the Roman tide, she needed the absolute support of her people and the religious authority of the pharaohs. The first major power struggle erupted almost immediately. Her brother's advisors, led by the eunuch Pothinus and the general Achilles, orchestrated a coup that forced Cleopatra into exile in Syria. But this is where her legendary strategic mind first appeared. While her brother was busy trying to impress the Roman general Pompey by assassinating him, Cleopatra was eyeing a bigger prize: Julius Caesar. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria in 48 BC, Cleopatra famously had herself smuggled into the palace, allegedly rolled inside a carpet or a laundry bag to bypass her brother's guards. It was a calculated risk that changed the course of history. Caesar was the most powerful man in the world, and by the next morning, he was her greatest ally. He was struck not just by her youth, but by the sharp, calculating mind that lay behind it. The ensuing siege of Alexandria was a brutal conflict. For months, The Roman legions and Cleopatra's supporters were trapped within the royal quarter, fighting off her brother's superior numbers. This was a war of claustrophobic urban combat, where the great library was partially burned and the very foundations of the city were shaken. Cleopatra remained by Caesar's side throughout, proving her resilience. When reinforcements finally arrived, and Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile in 47 BC, Cleopatra emerged as the sole ruler, but she was now inextricably tied to Rome. For several years, she lived in Rome as Caesar's guest, watching the inner workings of the Republic from a villa across the Tiber. She saw the Senate's corruption, the shifting loyalties, and the growing resentment toward Caesar's autocracy. She also bore him a son, Caesarion, whom she positioned as the heir to both Egypt and, potentially, Rome. The assassination of Caesar in 44 BC sent her fleeing back to Egypt. She knew that without Caesar, her position was precarious, and she spent the next few years rebuilding Egypt's economy, stockpiling grain, and waiting to see who would emerge from the Roman rubble. She managed a series of famines and plagues with a level of administrative efficiency that kept the Egyptian core stable while the rest of the Mediterranean descended into civil war. When the Roman world was split between Mark Antony and Octavian, Cleopatra saw her next move. That man was Mark Antony. When he summoned her to Tarsus in 41 BC, Cleopatra didn't arrive as a supplicant. She arrived as a goddess. She sailed up the Cydnus River on a barge with a gilded stern, purple sails, and silver oars, surrounded by the scent of exotic perfumes and the sound of flutes. It was a masterpiece of propaganda. She was showing Antony that while he had the soldiers, she had the wealth, the culture, and the divine right to rule. Their partnership was both romantic and deeply pragmatic. Together, they controlled the East. But while they were living in luxury in Alexandria, a young, cold, and remarkably disciplined man named Octavian was consolidating power in the West. He was the master of the long game, and he began to frame the conflict not as a political rivalry, but as a clash of civilizations. Octavian possessed a weapon more dangerous than any sword: the ability to control the narrative. He didn't have Antony's military charisma, but he had a genius for spin. He began a years-long campaign to paint Cleopatra as a monstrous foreign queen who had bewitched Antony with Eastern sorcery. He whispered to the Roman people that Antony had abandoned his Roman virtues for an Oriental lifestyle, wearing a diadem and acting like an Egyptian god. Octavian claimed that Cleopatra planned to move the capital of the empire from Rome to Alexandria, a terrifying prospect for the Roman elite. By 32 BC, the tension reached a breaking point. Octavian illegally seized Antony's will from the Temple of the Vestal Virgins and read it to the Senate. The will allegedly stated that Antony wanted to be buried in Alexandria alongside Cleopatra, and confirmed the donations of Alexandria, the giving of Roman lands to Cleopatra's children. This was the final straw. To the Romans, it looked like the ultimate betrayal of their very identity. The war that followed was decided at the Battle of Actium in September of 31 BC. It was a massive naval engagement off the coast of Greece, and it was a disaster for the lovers. The reasons for their defeat are still debated. Some suggest Antony's larger, more lumbering ships were no match for the smaller, more agile Liburnian vessels of Octavian's fleet. Others point to massive desertions and a plague that hit Antony's camp, leaving his rowers too weak to man the oars. But the most controversial moment came when Cleopatra's squadron of 60 ships suddenly turned and sailed away toward Egypt. Antony, seeing her leave, abandoned his men and followed her. While popular history often claims this was a collapse of nerve, more recent historical analysis suggests it might have been a prearranged tactical exit. They knew the battle was lost, and they chose to save the royal treasury and the core of the fleet to make a final stand in Egypt. Back in Alexandria, the atmosphere was one of a slow-motion collapse. Cleopatra and Antony spent their final months in a mixture of desperate military preparation and hedonistic denial. They formed a club called the Society of Partners in Death, where they threw lavish banquets, perhaps to numb the reality of the approaching Roman legions. But even then, Cleopatra was testing poisons. She watched how prisoners reacted to various toxins, looking for a way out that was both painless and dignified. She wasn't just being morbid. She was a scientist of her own demise, ensuring she wouldn't be taken alive. She was a master of optics until the very end, and she knew that the Roman triumph was a fate worse than death. As the summer of 30 BC arrived, Octavian's forces were closing in from both the east and the west. Antony led one final desperate cavalry charge, but his remaining fleet and infantry surrendered to Octavian before his eyes. Distraught and hearing a false report that Cleopatra had already committed suicide, Antony fell on his sword. He didn't die instantly. He was carried, bleeding, to the monumental tomb Cleopatra had built for herself. Because she was terrified of the doors being breached, she and her maids hauled the dying general up through a window using ropes. It was a gruesome, tragic scene that marked the end of their joint dream of an Eastern empire. Antony died in her arms, leaving her as the last obstacle to Octavian's total control. Now, Cleopatra was alone with Octavian's representatives. She was captured in her tomb, her daggers and her gold seized. Octavian himself visited her, and this is where the historical record gets murky. Some accounts say she tried to charm him. Others say she was sickly and disheveled, mourning Antony. But the core fact remains. She realized that Octavian intended to take her back to Rome. She saw through his polite lies. She knew that he needed her to walk behind his chariot in a triumph, a symbol of Rome's total domination over the Eastern menace. She also knew the fate of her children was in the balance. Her eldest son, Caesarion, was already being hunted by Roman agents. The final days were a masterpiece of deception. She asked for permission to visit Antony's grave one last time, a request Octavian granted, perhaps thinking her spirit was broken. She returned, took a bath, and ordered a grand meal. A local peasant arrived at the palace gates carrying a basket of figs, which the guards inspected and allowed through. Shortly after, Cleopatra sent a sealed letter to Octavian. When his guards burst into the room, they found the queen dead on her golden couch, perfectly dressed in her royal regalia. Her maid Eras lay dead at her feet, and Charmian was weakly adjusting the queen's crown before she, too, collapsed. The story of the asp, the Egyptian cobra, is the most famous ending in history, but it remains a historical hypothesis. A cobra's venom causes paralysis and respiratory failure, but it's not always fast, and it's not always fatal to 3 grown adults from a single snake. Some historians believe she used a poisoned ointment or a needle hidden in a hair comb, possibly containing a mix of opium, hemlock, and wolfsbane. This would have provided the tranquil death described by witnesses. There is also the persistent theory that Octavian, fearing a public execution would make her a martyr, had her assassinated or assisted her suicide. It would have been a convenient end for him. He got the kingdom without the political headache of a living queen, who could still inspire rebellion. When the news of her death reached Octavian, he was reportedly frustrated, but admired her spirit. He had her children taken to Rome, where they were raised by Antony's former wife, Octavia. Her eldest son, Caesarion, whom she claimed was the son of Julius Caesar, was not so lucky. Octavian had him tracked down and killed, famously saying, "Too many Caesars is not a good thing." With that act, the line of the pharaohs was extinguished forever. Egypt became a Roman province, a massive crown jewel that would fund the Roman Empire for centuries. The treasury of the Ptolemies was so vast that when it was brought to Rome, the interest rates in the city dropped by 2/3. Cleopatra's final act of sovereignty was a refusal to be a pawn. She understood that in the game of history, how you die often matters more than how you lived. By choosing her own end, she took the power away from Octavian and turned her story into a legend. She wasn't just a lover. She was the last great sovereign of the Hellenistic world, a woman who looked the rising sun of Rome in the eye and refused to blink. Her death was the closing chapter of an era, and while her palace is now mostly underwater, her defiance remains one of the most powerful stories ever told. The fall of Egypt marked the definitive end of the Hellenistic age, an era of cultural fusion and scientific advancement. But Cleopatra's legacy lived on as a shadow over the early Roman Empire. Augustus spent his reign trying to erase her influence, yet he kept her statue standing, perhaps as a reminder of the enemy he had to defeat to become a god. To this day, the search for her tomb continues, with archaeologists scanning the coast of Alexandria and the temple of Taposiris Magna, hoping to find the final resting place of the woman who nearly ruled the world. If you enjoyed this journey into the dark corners of the past, make sure to subscribe and join us for our next deep dive into the shadows of the past. The history of empires is written in blood, but it is the people who defy them that we remember. Was she a victim of fate or the ultimate master of her own myth? The answer remains buried under the sands of time, waiting for the next discovery to rewrite the legend.